"If you can fit into this dress, I'll marry you," said the tycoon, laughing, but soon regrets it. Richard Thompson pointed at Grace Williams with a cruel smile on his lips, while the guests at the lavish engagement party watched in tense silence. The housekeeper who had served that family for 5 long years was now at the center of a public humiliation that would make anyone tremble with shame. It was then that Richard raised his voice so everyone could clearly hear his venomous words. "If you can fit into this dress," he said, gesturing toward the mannequin displaying the red wedding gown, "I'll marry you." The laughter that followed echoed through the hall of the mansion in New York, accompanied by the nervous chuckles of guests who didn't know how to react to such cruelty. Grace Williams felt heat rising up her neck to her face, but her dark eyes didn't stray from the man humiliating her. At 42 years old, she had been through many hardships in life, but had never been exposed to such shame in front of so many important people. The main hall of the mansion, decorated with crystal chandeliers and arrangements of imported flowers, seemed to spin around her while dozens of curious eyes pierced her like daggers. "Are you serious?" asked Grace, her voice coming out stronger than she expected. Richard stopped laughing, surprised by the boldness of the question. At 35, the businessman of Lebanese origin had inherited a perfume and cosmetics empire that earned millions. Accustomed to having everyone bow before his wealth, he wasn't prepared to be questioned by a simple housekeeper. "Of course I'm serious," he replied, recovering his arrogant smile. "But we all know that's impossible. Look at you and look at the dress." The silence that took over the room was almost palpable. Jennifer Carter, Richard's official fiancée and daughter of a powerful agribusiness tycoon, watched the scene with an expression difficult to decipher. Dressed in an elegant blue silk outfit, she should have been radiating happiness at her engagement party, but there was something in her eyes that suggested otherwise. Grace looked around the hall, seeing familiar faces of employers she had worked for over the years, mansion staff who knew her well, and dozens of New York high society people who saw her as just part of the furniture. For a moment she thought about simply leaving and never returning. But something inside her, a strength she didn't even fully know herself, made her straighten her shoulders. "I accept," she said, her voice echoing through the silent hall. The shock was immediate. Richard completely lost his composure, his smile disappearing as if ripped from his face. The guests began murmuring among themselves, some laughing nervously, others seeming genuinely uncomfortable with the situation. You accept," stammered Richard, clearly not expecting this response. "Yes, Mr. Richard. You made a proposal in front of all these people. I accept the challenge." Mrs. Margaret Thompson, Richard's mother and family matriarch, who until then had observed the situation with the superior air of someone accustomed to this kind of behavior from her son, felt a pang of discomfort. There was something in Grace's posture that bothered her, a dignity that strongly contrasted with her son's casual cruelty. "Richard," whispered Jennifer, pulling the groom by the arm, "maybe it's better to stop this now." But it was already too late. The businessman had spoken the words before influential witnesses, people he did business with, traditional New York families. Backing out now would mean losing face, something unthinkable for someone with his excessive pride. "Very well," he said, trying to regain control of the situation. "If that's what you want, then put on the dress. But when you find out it doesn't fit, I want you to leave this house and never come back." Grace nodded calmly and began walking toward the mannequin. Each step she took seemed to echo across the polished marble floor, creating a hypnotic rhythm that kept everyone present in suspense. The red dress, with its jeweled details and perfect drape, was truly a work of art. Clearly it had cost a fortune and was made to measure. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, please take a moment to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps us who are just starting out. Now continuing. When Grace got close to the dress, something strange happened. She stopped abruptly, as if she had seen a ghost. Her hands, which had always been steady even in the most difficult moments, began to tremble slightly. "Is there a problem?" asked Richard sarcastically. "Giving up already?" Grace didn't answer immediately. Her eyes were fixed on the fabric of the dress, specifically on a detail on the back of the piece that most people couldn't see from where they were. It was a very specific embroidery, done by hand, in the shape of a jasmine flower. She knew that embroidery. She knew it very well. "This dress," she began to say, but stopped herself. "This dress what?" insisted Richard impatiently. "Nothing," said Grace, regaining her composure. "May I take the dress to a private area to try it on?" The question was reasonable, but Richard was so determined to humiliate her that he didn't even consider the possibility. "No," he replied coldly. "If you want to prove it fits, put it on right here in front of everyone. After all, you're the one who accepted the challenge." Mrs. Martha, the head housekeeper of the mansion and one of the few people who really knew Grace, stepped forward. "Mr. Richard, perhaps it would be more appropriate." "Martha, you weren't consulted," Richard cut in sharply. "Grace made her choice." What no one in the room knew was that Grace Williams wasn't just an ordinary domestic worker. Before coming to that mansion, she had had a completely different life. At 20, she had worked as a seamstress, specializing in party dresses in one of the most prestigious ateliers in the garment district. She had a trained eye for fabrics, cuts, and adjustments. And when she looked at that dress with her technical experience, she noticed something no one else had. The dress wasn't new. It was very old, probably over 30 years old, but it had been perfectly preserved and masterfully restored. Moreover, the original size was quite different from what it appeared. Someone had made very skillful adjustments to make it seem smaller than it really was. "I need a pair of scissors," Grace said calmly. "Scissors?" Richard almost shouted. "Have you gone mad? You're not going to destroy a dress that cost more than you earn in 5 years." "I'm not going to destroy anything," Grace replied with a calm that even impressed herself. "But if you want me to prove that I can wear this dress, I first need to undo some adjustments that were poorly done." The revelation caused an immediate buzz among the guests. How could a simple maid know technical details about a haute couture dress? Mrs. Margaret, who had remained silent until then, slowly approached. There was something about the way Grace spoke about the dress that deeply unsettled her. "What kind of adjustments?" asked the matriarch, her voice laden with a tension she couldn't hide. Grace looked directly at the older woman and said, "This dress was originally made for someone much larger than it appears now. Someone sewed the back to reduce the drape, probably to keep it as a memento. But the stitches were done hastily, without proper technical care. If I undo these improper seams, the dress will return to its original size." The silence that followed was different from the previous ones. This time, there was a palpable tension in the air, as if everyone sensed that something very important was happening, but couldn't quite identify what it was. Mrs. Margaret felt her heart race. How could that woman know such specific details about a dress that had been stored away for decades? A dress that... "Where did you get this dress, Richard?" she asked her son, her voice coming out sharper than she intended. Richard seemed confused by the question. "From your closet, Mother. You said I could take any old dress to use as decoration for the party. You said it was just an old dress you didn't wear anymore." Mrs. Margaret turned completely pale. Her legs trembled and she had to lean against the wall. Martha, realizing something was very wrong, quickly approached. "Mrs. Margaret, are you all right?" "This dress, yes," whispered the matriarch as if speaking to herself. How can she know? Grace watched the woman's reaction with growing understanding. That jasmine embroidery, the quality of the fabric, the specific shape of the cut. It couldn't be a coincidence. "You know this dress, don't you?" Grace asked gently. You can't know about the dress," said Mrs. Margaret, her voice almost a whisper. "No one can know. I never told anyone." The drama unfolding began to attract the attention of everyone present. Jennifer, who until then had observed everything with a mix of boredom and irritation, was now genuinely intrigued. Richard seemed completely lost, not understanding why his mother was reacting that way. "Mother, what are you talking about? It's just an old dress you kept in the closet." "It's not just an old dress," exploded Mrs. Margaret with an intensity that surprised everyone. This was your maternal grandmother's wedding dress." The impact of the revelation was immediate. Richard recoiled as if he had been punched in the stomach. Using his grandmother's wedding dress, a woman he revered, to humiliate a maid. The gravity of what he had done began to weigh on him like a stone. "Grandma Eleanor's dress?" he asked, his voice coming out weak. Yes, confirmed Mrs. Margaret, tears beginning to form in her eyes. The dress she wore when she married your grandfather in 1952. The dress she brought from Lebanon and always said would be passed down to the future brides of the family. Grace felt her heart accelerate. Eleanor. That name echoed in her mind like a distant bell, bringing fragmented memories she had tried to bury long ago. "Eleanor Thompson?" she asked, her voice coming out more urgent than she intended. All heads turned to her. How could a maid know the name of the family's deceased matriarch? "Yes," replied Mrs. Margaret, now looking at Grace with an expression of complete bewilderment. "But why do you know that name?" Grace closed her eyes for a moment, trying to organize her thoughts. When she opened them again, there was an iron determination in her gaze. "Because Eleanor Thompson was my employer 25 years ago. I worked for her when I was just a girl. I was the one who helped make the final adjustments to this dress before she stored it away." The shock was so great that several people in the room gasped audibly. Richard seemed to have completely lost the ability to speak. "That's impossible," murmured Mrs. Margaret. "My mother-in-law never had young housemaids. She always preferred older, more experienced women." "It's true," confirmed Grace. "I wasn't a housemaid. I was a sewing apprentice at the studio where your mother-in-law used to have her clothes altered. The studio was located at 847 7th Avenue. The owner was named Mrs. Hope and had only 2 employees, me and an older woman named Rose." The precision of the details left Mrs. Margaret astonished. She clearly remembered bringing her mother-in-law's clothes to that specific studio. She remembered the older woman, Mrs. Hope, and vaguely recalled a girl who was always working quietly in the corner. You're Grace Williams?" asked Mrs. Margaret, as if an old memory was resurfacing. "Yes, Mum." "My God," whispered the matriarch. "Eleanor used to talk about you. She said you had golden hands for sewing, that you were the only person she trusted to work on her most precious clothes." The revelation created a wave of murmurs through the hall. The guests couldn't believe what they were witnessing. A simple maid with direct connections to the late matriarch of the family. It was as if they were watching a soap opera drama. Richard finally found his voice, but his words came out weak and uncertain. But how did you end up working here? If you knew my grandmother, if she trusted you, how—" Grace took a deep breath before answering. "Your grandmother passed away in 1998, Mr. Richard. At that time, I was going through a very difficult period in my life. I had just gotten divorced, was alone with a young daughter to raise, and the studio where I worked went bankrupt right after Mrs. Eleanor died. Those were the worst years of my life." She paused, observing the attentive faces around her. "I looked for jobs in several households, but nobody wanted to hire a seamstress. Everyone needed maids, not someone who knew how to work with needle and thread. So I learned to clean, to cook, to take care of a house. When I heard you were looking for a maid, I applied. I never mentioned my connection with Mrs. Eleanor, because I thought nobody would care." Grace's story touched some hearts in the hall, but it also generated a palpable discomfort. Here was a woman who had lost everything and rebuilt herself in the shadows, serving the same family for whom she had once provided specialized services. Jennifer, who had been observing the whole situation with growing interest, finally spoke up. "And your daughter, what happened to her?" "She graduated from nursing school last year," Grace replied with visible pride. "She works at Memorial Hospital. Everything I managed to achieve was through working in this house." The answer silenced Richard in a way no scolding could have achieved. Here was a woman who had sacrificed her dignity and her talents to ensure a better future for her daughter, while he wasted money on extravagant parties. Mrs. Margaret slowly approached the dress, her hands trembling slightly. "Eleanor always said this dress was special, that it had a story. She told me that when she was young in Lebanon, a very talented seamstress had made unique alterations to it, so it could be worn by different generations of women in the family. She said the seamstress had taught her daughter all the secrets." Grace nodded slowly. "Mrs. Hope taught me everything she knew. She had learned from a Lebanese seamstress who came to America in the 1940s. The tradition of altering dresses so they could be worn by multiple generations of the same family was very common among immigrant families." "So you really can make the dress fit?" asked Richard, his voice now devoid of any trace of arrogance. "I can," confirmed Grace, "but I need to ask one thing first." "What?" "Will you honor your word if the dress fits me?" The question caught Richard completely off guard. In his arrogance, he had presumed it would be impossible for Grace to wear the dress. Now, facing the real possibility that she might succeed, the weight of his promise pressed down on him like a mountain. All eyes in the hall were fixed on him, awaiting a response. Jennifer watched him with an unreadable expression. His mother seemed to be silently praying. The guests murmured softly among themselves. "I—" began Richard, but he couldn't finish the sentence. "You made a promise before all of us," said Grace firmly. "I need to know if your word means anything." The humiliation of being publicly questioned about his honor was almost unbearable for Richard, but he couldn't deny that Grace was right. He had made the promise in front of dozens of respectable witnesses. "Yes," he finally said, his voice sounding defeated, "I will honor my word." Grace nodded and walked over to the dress. With precise and experienced movements, she began examining the seams, pinpointing exactly where the improper adjustments she had mentioned had been made. "May I have the scissors now?" she asked. Martha hurried to fetch the tool, returning quickly. When Grace received the scissors, several people in the hall moved closer to get a better look at what she was doing. With surgical care, Grace began undoing specific stitches on the back of the dress. Each movement was precise, revealing years of experience and a deep understanding of the garment. In just a few minutes, the dress began to take on a slightly different shape. "Incredible," murmured one of the guests. "She really knows what she's doing." When Grace finished the adjustments, the dress seemed to have come to life. The fabric draped more naturally, and it was evident that the size had increased considerably. "Now I need to change," she said simply. Mrs. Margaret, who had observed the entire process in reverent silence, pointed to one of the nearby rooms. "Use the guest room. Martha, go with her to help with whatever is needed." As Grace headed to the room, the hall buzzed with hushed conversations. No one could believe what they were witnessing. A domestic worker who had known the family matriarch, who possessed specialized sewing skills, and who now might actually manage to wear the family's sacred dress. Jennifer took advantage of Grace's absence to approach Richard. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" she whispered, her voice filled with contained anger. "Jennifer, You humiliated a woman who knew your own grandmother, a woman who has worked in this house for 5 years and whom you treat as if she were invisible, and on top of that, using the most sacred dress in your family." Richard felt the weight of guilt crushing his chest. For the first time in years, he was being forced to confront the consequences of his actions. "I didn't know about her connection to my grandmother," he said weakly. "And that justifies the cruelty?" Jennifer retorted. "Even if she were a complete stranger, even if she had never set foot in this house before, what you did would be unacceptable." Jennifer's words echoed through the hall, heard by several nearby guests. Many of them began to see Richard in a different light, perceiving a side of his personality that had been masked by wealth and superficial charm. In the guest room, Grace looked at the red dress laid out on the bed. Memories of her youth came flooding back with full force. She clearly remembered the day Mrs. Eleanor had brought that dress to the workshop, explaining its family importance and asking for it to be stored properly. "Mrs. Grace," said Martha softly, "are you sure you want to do this?" "Why?" "Because even if the dress fits, even if Mr. Richard keeps his word, your life is going to change completely, and maybe not for the better." Grace considered Martha's words. It was true she hadn't fully thought through the consequences of her decision. She had acted on impulse, driven by a mix of indignation and something deeper that she herself couldn't identify. "Martha, can I ask you something?" "Of course, Mrs. Grace." "What do you think of Mr. Richard as a person?" Martha hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with the question. "It's not my place to judge the employers, Mrs. Grace. I'm asking as a friend, not as an employee." Martha looked around, making sure they were alone, before answering. "He's not a bad person deep down, Mrs. Grace, but he's very spoiled. He never had to fight for anything in life, never faced real difficulties. Sometimes I think he doesn't even realize his actions hurt people." And his fiancée? Mrs. Jennifer? Martha smiled slightly. That one is different. She has character. I've seen her defending staff when Mr. Richard was being unfair. She doesn't truly love him, anyone can see that. But she's a good person. The information about Jennifer intrigued Grace. If the bride herself didn't love Richard, why was she marrying him? Why is she marrying him then? Family business, I imagine. Her father and the Thompsons have companies that complement each other, but I've heard her crying on the phone to a friend about how trapped she feels in this situation. Grace absorbed the information as she began to change. Perhaps her impulsive action could have positive consequences for more people than just herself. When she finally put on the dress, Grace felt a transformation that went far beyond the physical. The fabric adjusted to her body as if it had been made especially for her. The years of domestic work had kept her figure in good shape, and the red color enhanced her olive skin in a stunning way. "My God," whispered Martha, bringing her hands to her mouth. You are too beautiful." Grace looked at herself in the mirror and barely recognized her own image. It wasn't just a matter of clothing. It was as if wearing that specific dress, with all its history and meaning, had awakened something inside her that had been asleep for years. "I'm ready," she said, her voice coming out with a confidence that surprised even herself. When the hall doors opened and Grace emerged wearing the red dress, the silence was absolute. It wasn't just because the dress fit perfectly, it was because the transformation was so dramatic that she seemed like a completely different person. Richard felt as if he had been punched in the stomach. The woman he had tried to humiliate minutes before was now walking toward him with an elegance and dignity that rivaled any socialite present in the hall. Mrs. Margaret began to cry silently. Seeing that dress being worn again brought powerful memories of her mother-in-law, but also a deep understanding that something very significant was happening. Jennifer watched Grace with something close to admiration. There was an inner strength in that woman that she recognized and envied. It was the kind of strength that comes from someone who has been through many battles and emerged victorious. "The dress fits," Grace said simply, stopping in front of Richard. He couldn't speak. All the sarcasm, all the arrogance had disappeared. Before him stood a dignified, elegant woman who had accepted his cruel challenge and emerged victorious. "Yes," he managed to murmur finally, "it fits perfectly." "Then will you honor your word?" The question echoed through the hall like a final challenge. All those present awaited the answer, some with morbid curiosity, others with genuine concern about what would happen next. Richard looked around the hall, seeing the faces of people he had known for years, people he did business with, people whose opinions mattered for his social and professional reputation. There was no turning back without completely losing credibility. He began, but was interrupted by a firm voice. "He will honor it," said Jennifer, stepping forward, "and I will make it easier for him." Everyone turned to the official bride, surprised by her intervention. "Jennifer, what are you doing?" asked Richard, confused. "I'm setting you free," she replied, removing the engagement ring from her finger. "And setting myself free too." The gesture left everyone stunned. Jennifer extended the ring to Richard, who took it automatically, still not fully processing what was happening. "You don't love me, Richard, and I don't love you. We're together because of family pressure, for business convenience. But real love? There never was any." Jennifer's brutal honesty created an uncomfortable silence in the hall. "But—" Richard tried to protest. "No buts. You made an impulsive promise that could have real consequences. Maybe it's time for you to stop playing with people's feelings and take on real responsibilities." Jennifer turned to Grace, who had watched the entire scene with a growing expression of surprise. "Grace, you are a brave woman. Whatever you decide to do from now on, you have my respect and my support." With that, Jennifer crossed the hall and left, leaving behind a heavy silence and a situation that no one knew how to resolve. Mrs. Margaret was the first to recover from the shock. "Perhaps it's best we discuss this in private," she suggested, looking around the hall full of guests. "No," said Grace firmly. "Your son made the proposal in public. Whether he will honor it or not should be decided right here, in front of everyone." Grace's courage impressed even those who were already sympathetic to her. Demanding a public resolution showed a strength of character not seen every day. Richard felt cornered. On one hand, fulfilling a promise made in a moment of arrogance seemed absurd. On the other, he had been raised with values that emphasized the importance of honoring one's word. "Grace," he said finally, "do you understand that if I keep my promise, your life will change completely?" "I understand. You won't have the same freedom you have now. You'll be subjected to constant public scrutiny. Your private life will cease to exist. And do you understand that if you don't keep your promise, your word will be worth nothing to anyone here present?" Grace's response was spot on. Richard looked around and saw in the guests' faces that she was right. Backing out now would be interpreted as cowardice and dishonesty. "All right," he said, his voice sounding defeated. "I honor my word." What happened next surprised everyone, including Grace. Instead of showing victory or satisfaction, she seemed almost sad. "Thank you," she said simply, "but I need time to think about this." "Time to think?" asked Richard, confused. "Yes. You made an impulsive promise. I accepted an impulsive challenge. But marriage is no game. I need to consider if this is what I really want." The maturity of Grace's response earned the immediate respect of all present. Even though she had won the challenge, she wasn't acting out of thirst for revenge or greed. She was being responsible and thoughtful. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, please take a moment to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps us who are just starting out. Now continuing. Mrs. Margaret approached Grace. "My dear, you demonstrated a wisdom today that many of us don't have. How about we have dinner together tomorrow? I would really like to talk with you about my mother-in-law, about the past, about many things." "It would be an honor, Mrs. Margaret." The party, which had started as an engagement celebration, was clearly coming to an end in a way no one could have predicted. The guests began saying their goodbyes, many of them still commenting on the extraordinary events they had witnessed. Richard remained in the hall even after most people had left, looking at the red dress that Grace had carefully arranged over a chair before returning to her maid uniform. "Richard," said Mrs. Margaret, approaching her son, "we need to talk. Mother, I know I made a terrible mistake today." "It wasn't just a mistake, my son. It was an unnecessary cruelty toward a person who deserves our respect." Richard sat in one of the armchairs, suddenly looking much younger and more vulnerable than his 35 years. "I don't know what came over me. When I saw her there looking like she didn't belong in our world, I felt like putting her in her place." "And what is her place, Richard?" I don't know anymore." The confession was honest and painful. Mrs. Margaret sat beside her son. "Your grandmother Eleanor always told me that true nobility doesn't come from money or a last name. It comes from character, from how we treat those with less power than us. I know, Mother, you and she always taught me that, but sometimes I forget." "You can't forget, Richard. Not when your actions hurt people who did nothing to deserve it." While mother and son talked in the hall, Grace was in her small room in the mansion's annex, looking out the window and trying to process everything that had happened. In a single night, her life had been turned upside down. A soft knock on the door pulled her from her thoughts. "Come in." It was Martha bringing a cup of tea. "I thought you might need this." "Thank you, Martha. Please, sit down." The two women sat in silence for a few moments, each lost in her own thoughts. "Martha, can I ask you something?" "Of course." "Do you think I did the right thing?" Martha considered the question carefully before answering. "I think you did what you had to do. No one deserves to be humiliated, the way Mr. Richard tried to humiliate you. You defended yourself with dignity. But what now? What happens now? Only you can decide that. But can I say one thing? You showed a strength today that I didn't know existed. Whatever your decision, I'm sure it will be the right one." Grace smiled for the first time since everything had started. "You know, Martha, when I was younger and worked in the atelier, I used to dream of having my own sewing shop. I wanted to make beautiful dresses for brides, for graduates, for women who wanted to feel special on important days. And why did you never pursue that dream?" Life happened. The divorce, raising my daughter, the bills to pay. Little by little, the dream grew smaller until it almost disappeared. Maybe it's time to bring it back. Martha's suggestion planted a seed in Grace. Perhaps that bizarre situation was an opportunity in disguise. The next morning, Richard woke with a strange feeling. For the first time in years, he wasn't eager to go to the office or solve business problems. He was thinking about Grace and the promise he had made. During breakfast, Mrs. Margaret watched him silently before speaking. "Have you decided what you're going to do? I'm going to talk with her today. I need to understand better who she really is, beyond the maid I thought I knew. And if she decides to accept your proposal..." The question left Richard speechless. He had spent the whole night hoping Grace would refuse, that she would free him from the awkward situation. But what if she didn't? "I don't know, Mother. Honestly, I don't know." At that very moment, Grace was in the mansion's garden, watering the plants as she did every morning. But today, there was something different in her movements. She seemed more determined, as if she had reached an important conclusion during the night. Richard found her there, wearing her usual uniform, but there was something in her posture that was completely new. "Good morning, Grace." "Good morning, Mr. Richard. Can we talk?" "Of course." They walked to a bench in the garden, where they sat with a respectful distance between them. "Grace, about yesterday," Richard began. "You don't need to apologize," she interrupted. "You made a promise and said you would honor it. Now I need to decide if I will accept it." "And have you decided?" Grace looked at the plants around her before answering. "I have some conditions." The answer surprised Richard. He had expected a yes or a no, not a negotiation. "What kind of conditions?" "If I agree to marry you, it won't be a marriage like others. It will be a partnership." "How so?" "You have money and connections. I have skills and dreams. I want to open a sewing studio, a place where I can teach underprivileged youth to work with fabrics and needles. I want it to be a real business, not charity." Richard was surprised by the proposal. It was much more elaborate and thought out than he had imagined. "Go on. If we marry, it will be as business partners. I help you become a better person, more aware of the world around you. You help me achieve my professional dreams. And love and intimacy. Those things can't be forced, Mr. Richard. They either happen naturally or they don't. But respect and partnership can be built through actions and decisions." The maturity of the proposal impressed Richard deeply. Grace was offering a practical and dignified solution to a situation that had started as a cruel humiliation. "You've thought of everything, haven't you?" "I spent the whole night thinking. I can refuse your proposal and continue my life as a housekeeper, or I can accept and try to build something new. The second option is riskier but also more interesting." Richard remained silent for a few minutes, processing the proposal. It was very different from any relationship he had imagined having, but there was an honesty in it that was attractive. "And if it doesn't work out? Then we part ways as civilized people. I'm not talking about eternal love, Mr. Richard. I'm talking about a partnership that can benefit both of us." "Can I have time to think?" "Of course, but not too much time. My daughter is coming to visit me this weekend, and I would like to have an answer to give her." Richard nodded and stood up. "Grace?" "Yes?" "Thank you for not humiliating me yesterday, even though you had every reason to do so." "Humiliating others doesn't make anyone greater, Mr. Richard. It only makes the person smaller." Grace's words echoed in Richard's mind as he walked back to the house. For the first time in his life, he was being forced to confront his own limitations as a human being. That afternoon, Mrs. Margaret went to visit Grace as she had promised. They met in the mansion's private sitting room, where Mrs. Margaret had asked for tea to be served. "Grace, I want you to tell me about my mother-in-law, about what she was like when you met her." Grace smiled at the memory. Mrs. Eleanor was a very elegant lady, but also very demanding. She knew exactly what she wanted and wouldn't accept shoddy work. But she was fair, always paid well and never yelled. "Did she talk about the family?" "Sometimes. She talked about the son who was building a business, about the daughter-in-law who had just married. But she really talked about her grandson." "About Richard?" Yes. She said he was very smart, but she worried if he was learning the right values. She always repeated, "Wealth can be lost in one generation, but character lasts forever." The words hit Mrs. Margaret squarely. It was exactly the kind of thing her mother-in-law would say. "Did she leave anything specific for you at the atelier? Some keepsake?" "Yes, she did. A small sewing box with special tools she had brought from Lebanon. She said that one day I might need them for something important." Grace stood up and left the small room for a few minutes, returning with a small old box. "I've kept it all these years. Never knew why." Mrs. Margaret opened the box with trembling hands. Inside were old needles, golden thread, small decorative pins, and a handwritten note in Arabic. "My God," she whispered, "do you know what this note says?" "No, ma'am, I never managed to translate it. It says, 'To the girl with the golden hands. Use these tools to sew destinies, not just fabrics. Eleanor Thompson, 1997. The silence that followed was charged with emotion. It was as if Eleanor had foreseen that those tools would one day play an important role in Grace's life. "Mrs. Margaret, may I ask a personal question?" "Of course." "Do you think I'm doing the right thing, considering marrying your son?" Mrs. Margaret thought carefully before answering. "I think you're being brave, and I think Richard needs someone like you in his life, someone who isn't afraid to challenge him, to show him what truly matters. And if it doesn't work out, then at least you will have tried something authentic. That's more than many traditional marriages can say." Over the weekend, Grace's daughter arrived for the promised visit. Lindsay was a 23-year-old young woman, a nursing graduate with a strong personality that she had clearly inherited from her mother. "Mom, are you crazy?" was her first reaction when Grace told her about the events at the party and Richard's proposal. "Maybe I am," admitted Grace, "but sometimes craziness is the only way to change a situation that isn't working." "But marrying your boss, someone who tried to humiliate you. He won't be my boss if we get married. He'll be my partner. And the humiliation, well, I think he learned something from it." Lindsay shook her head, clearly worried. "Mom, you worked your whole life to give me a future. Now that I've graduated, that I can take care of myself, you don't need to sacrifice anymore." "It's not a sacrifice, Lindsay. It's an opportunity, a chance to do something I've always wanted to do." "The atelier." "Yes, but more than that. A chance to prove that people from different backgrounds can build something together." Lindsay watched her mother for a long moment before speaking. "If that's what you really want, I support you. But I want to meet this man before you make any final decision. Of course, I'll arrange for you to meet." The meeting was set for the following Sunday during lunch. Richard was visibly nervous when Lindsay arrived. The young woman had a strong presence and a direct gaze that made him feel as if he were being evaluated. "So you're the man who wants to marry my mother," she said bluntly. "Actually, it was your mother who proposed the marriage terms," replied Richard, trying not to sound defensive. "Oh, really? And what do you think of these terms?" "I think your mother is a very intelligent woman who proposed a creative solution to a complicated situation." "And are you willing to honor these terms?" "I am." Lindsay studied Richard's face for a few moments before continuing. "My mother is the strongest person I know. She gave up her dreams to raise me. Now that I'm settled, she deserves the chance to fulfill those dreams." "I completely agree. If you hurt her, if you break any promise you make, I will make your life very difficult. Understood?" The threat was spoken calmly, but Richard had no doubt she was serious. "I understand, and I respect your concern for your mother." "Good. Now tell me about this atelier you're planning." The conversation went on for 2 hours, and by the end, Lindsay seemed slightly more at ease with the situation. "Mom, can I speak with you privately?" she asked when lunch was over. The two women walked to the garden. "He seems sincere," said Lindsay, "but I still think you're taking too big a risk." "All important dreams involve risks, my daughter." "All right, but I want you to promise me one thing." "What?" "If at any point you're not happy, if he's not keeping his promises, you'll leave. You won't stay out of obligation or pride." "I promise." With her daughter's reluctant blessing, Grace finally felt ready to give her answer to Richard. On Monday morning, she went to see him in the mansion's office. "Mr. Richard, I've made my decision. And I accept your proposal, but I want everything formalized legally. Contracts, prenuptial agreements, everything documented to protect us both. Of course, I'll have the lawyers prepare everything. And I want the atelier to be mine legally. I don't want it seen as a donation from you or a favor. I want it to be my business." "Understood. And one last thing." "Yes?" "I want a small wedding. Just our families and a few close friends. Nothing showy." Richard smiled for the first time since the whole situation had begun. "Actually, I prefer it that way too." The wedding preparations took 2 months. During that time, Grace and Richard got to know each other better, talking regularly about their plans for the future and their expectations for the relationship. To their surprise, they discovered they had more in common than they expected. Both valued hard work, family, and had a similar sense of humor. It wasn't passion, but it was a solid foundation to build something lasting. Grace's atelier took shape quickly. With Richard's financial support and her own skills, she managed to rent a space in downtown New York and equip it properly. The plan was to offer sewing classes for underprivileged youth, in addition to providing haute couture services for private clients. 1 week before the wedding, Jennifer showed up at the mansion for a surprise visit. "I came to wish you both happiness," she said, hugging Grace warmly. "Thank you, Jennifer. How are you?" "Better than I imagined. You freed me from a marriage that would have been a lie. Now I'm dating someone I truly love. The mechanic Martha told me about." "Exactly. My father doesn't approve, but for the first time in my life, I'm making choices for myself, not to please others." "And Richard?" asked Grace. "How do you see him now?" "Changed. These last few weeks have transformed him. He's more aware, more humble. You've been good for him, Grace. I hope it continues." The wedding took place in a small church in the neighborhood where Grace had grown up. It was a simple but moving ceremony. Mrs. Margaret cried throughout the ceremony, constantly remembering her mother-in-law and how happy she would have been to see this union. Lindsay was Grace's maid of honor, and surprisingly, she and Richard had developed a relationship of mutual respect. Richard's closest cousin served as best man. During the vows, Grace and Richard spoke about partnership, respect, and mutual growth. They weren't words of romantic passion, but they were honest and touching. After the ceremony, there was a small reception at Grace's atelier. It was symbolic, the start of a new life in a space that represented her dreams. "To Grace and Richard," said Mrs. Margaret during the toast, "may they build something beautiful and lasting together." The first months of marriage were a constant adjustment. Grace moved into the mansion but maintained her independence, dividing her time between her responsibilities as a wife and a businesswoman. The atelier prospered quickly. The combination of Grace's skills with Richard's network of contacts created a surprising demand for her services. Within 6 months, she already had a waiting list of clients. More importantly, the atelier's social project was working. 12 underprivileged youths had enrolled in the first course, and 3 of them had already gotten jobs at other clothing companies. "How do you feel?" Richard asked one evening as they were having dinner together. "Fulfilled," Grace replied simply. "For the first time in years, I feel like I'm doing what I was born to do." "And about us? How do you feel about our marriage?" Grace considered the question carefully. "I feel like we're building something solid. It's not passion, but it's a true partnership. And sometimes I think partnership is more important than passion." "Sometimes I watch you working at the atelier and I'm impressed," Richard confessed. "You have a determination I've never seen in anyone. And I watch you when you're helping the youths in the project, and I see a side of you I didn't know, a gentle side. You brought that side out." "I didn't, Richard. I just helped you remember it." Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, please take a moment to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps us who are just starting out. Now, continuing. 1 year after the marriage, Grace discovered she was pregnant. The news was met with mixed joy and apprehension. They both knew a child would completely change the dynamics of their relationship. "Are you happy?" Richard asked after the doctor confirmed the pregnancy. "I am, and you?" "Me too, but I'm nervous." Why? Because I want to be a better father than I was as a person. I want our child to grow up knowing that all people have value, regardless of their background. He will learn that, Grace assured him, because we will teach by example. The pregnancy brought practical changes as well. Grace had to hire more staff for the atelier and reorganize her schedule. Richard became more involved in the social projects, taking on administrative responsibilities that allowed Grace to focus on the creative side of the business. During one of the prenatal checkups, the doctor commented on how the two seemed like a united couple. "Did you marry for love?" he asked, making conversation. Grace and Richard looked at each other and laughed. "We married out of necessity," Grace replied. "Love is growing little by little." "Sometimes that's better," the doctor said. "Love built on a solid foundation often lasts longer." In the 6th month of pregnancy, Grace received a special order. A wealthy client wanted her to reproduce an old dress for her daughter's wedding. When Grace saw the specifications, she realized it was a model very similar to the red dress she had worn on the night that changed her life. "It's a sign," Mrs. Margaret said when Grace told her about the order. "A sign of what?" "That you've found your true destiny. Eleanor always said that destinies repeated themselves until we learned the right lessons." Working on that dress brought powerful memories back for Grace. She remembered the night of the party, the initial humiliation, the courage she found to accept the challenge. Now, almost 2 years later, her life was completely different. When the baby was born, a girl they named Eleanor in honor of Richard's grandmother, it was as if the family was finally complete. Lindsay became a devoted aunt, Mrs. Margaret a proud grandmother, and Richard a surprisingly natural father. "She has your eyes," Richard said to Grace as they watched their daughter sleeping. "And your stubborn temperament," Grace replied affectionately. "What kind of life do you think she'll have? A life where she'll know she can be anything she wants to be, as long as she works for it and treats people with respect." 2 years after Eleanor's birth, Grace's atelier had become a small, successful business. She employed 15 people and had contracts with several department stores. The social project had trained over 50 young people, many of whom now had their own businesses. Richard, inspired by his wife's success, had restructured his own company to include social responsibility programs. The perfume company now funded technical schools and offered internships for low-income youth. "Remember the party where we truly met?" Richard asked one evening as they strolled through the mansion's garden. "How could I forget? It was the night that changed our lives. Have you ever regretted it?" "Never," Grace replied without hesitation. "And you?" "Me, neither. In fact, I'm grateful I was forced to honor my word. It was the best thing that ever happened to me. Even though it wasn't a marriage for love." "Who says it's not for love?" Richard asked, stopping in his tracks. Grace looked at him, surprised by the declaration. "What do you mean?" "I mean the love we have may not have started as romantic passion, but it's real. It's love based on respect, admiration, partnership. It's love that grew through actions, not just words." Grace felt tears forming in her eyes. It was true. Over the past few years, she had developed deep feelings for Richard. It wasn't the burning passion from movies, but it was something more solid and lasting. "I love you too," she said softly. It was the first "I love you" exchanged between them, coming more than 3 years after the marriage. But it came at the right time, when both knew exactly what it meant. On their 5th wedding anniversary, they threw a party to celebrate not just the marriage, but the success of their businesses and social projects. The party was held in the same hall where everything had begun, but this time the atmosphere was completely different. Among the guests were employees from the atelier, young people who had completed the sewing courses, business people who supported the social projects, and families who had benefited from the programs Grace and Richard had created together. 5 years ago, Richard said during his speech, "I made a terrible mistake in this very hall. I tried to humiliate an extraordinary woman because of my own prejudice and arrogance." There was a respectful silence among the guests, many of whom knew the story. "Today I can say that mistake was the best thing that ever happened to me, because it led me to truly know the person who would make me a better version of myself." Richard turned to Grace, who was sitting beside him holding little Eleanor. "Grace, you didn't just accept my challenge that night. You challenged me to grow, to learn, to become the man my grandmother always wanted me to be." The emotion in the hall was palpable. Many people were visibly moved. 5 years later, we have a beautiful family, thriving businesses, and hundreds of lives we've touched through our projects. But more important than that, we have a partnership based on values that truly matter. When it was Grace's turn to speak, she stood up with Eleanor in her arms. "That night, when Richard challenged me to wear that dress, I could have simply refused and walked out of here. It would have been the most sensible reaction. But something inside me decided it was time to stop accepting being treated as invisible. It was time to show that every person has dignity and worth." She looked around the hall, seeing attentive and respectful faces. "What we've discovered these 5 years is that destiny-arranged marriages can work as well as heart-arranged marriages. Perhaps even better, because they're based on conscious choices, not just feelings. Richard and I choose every day to build something together. We choose to grow, learn, and be better for each other and for our community." Little Eleanor chose that moment to babble something unintelligible, drawing affectionate laughter from those present. And now we have this little one to remind us that the future is built through love and the example we set. After the speeches, the party continued with music and dancing. Grace and Richard danced together for the first time since the wedding, and there was an ease between them that hadn't existed before. "Did you imagine we'd get here when you accepted my challenge?" Richard asked as they danced. "I imagined we'd survive," Grace replied with a smile. "I didn't imagine we'd thrive so much." "And now, what do you imagine for our future?" "I imagine we'll keep growing, as people, as a couple, as a family, and I imagine we'll help many other people grow too." 2 years later, when Eleanor turned 4, she gained a younger brother they named Richard Jr. The arrival of their second child further solidified the family that had begun so unusually. Grace had expanded the atelier again, now with a second unit specializing in children's clothing. The social project had become a national reference, attracting visitors from other states interested in replicating the model. Richard had assumed the presidency of a business organization dedicated to promoting socially responsible practices. His personal transformation had become an example for other entrepreneurs. "Mommy," Eleanor said one day while Grace worked on a new dress, "why did you and Daddy get married?" It was a question Grace knew would come eventually, but she still wasn't sure how to answer. "Because sometimes destiny puts us in the right place, at the right time to learn important lessons." "But did you love each other?" "We learn to love each other, and sometimes the love we learn is stronger than the love we simply feel." The girl seemed satisfied with the explanation, as children often are when they receive honest answers. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Grace and Richard decided to renew their vows. This time, the words were very different from the original ones. "Richard," Grace said during the ceremony, 10 years ago you challenged me in a cruel way, but destiny turned that cruelty into opportunity. Today I challenge you in a loving way. May we continue growing together for the next 10 years. "Grace," Richard replied, 10 years ago I was a small man trying to make you feel smaller. Today I'm a better man because you taught me that greatness comes from lifting others up, not from putting them down." The ceremony was held in the mansion's garden, with both children carrying the rings. Lindsay, now married with children of her own, was again Grace's maid of honor. Jennifer was also present, married to her mechanic and happy in a way she never had been when engaged to Richard. Mrs. Margaret, now an 80-year-old grandmother, but still lucid and active, cried with emotion throughout the ceremony. After the vow renewal, there was a retrospective of their 10 years of marriage, photos of the atelier in its various phases, of the young people who graduated from the courses, of the implemented social projects, of the children born of family moments. "You know what impresses me most about this story?" said Martha, who had become a close family friend over the years. "It all started with someone trying to prove that another person wasn't good enough and turned into two people helping each other become better than they thought possible." Martha's words perfectly captured the essence of the journey Grace and Richard had taken together. 15 years after that fateful night at the engagement party, Grace was in her office at the atelier, now a medium-sized company employing over 100 people. She was 47 years old and had become a respected businesswoman and a well-known figure in the community. Richard entered the office, carrying an envelope. "An interesting letter arrived today," he said. "From whom?" "The mayor. They want to honor you as Social Entrepreneur of the Year." Grace smiled but didn't seem surprised. "And you? How do you feel seeing your wife receive this kind of recognition?" "Proud. And grateful I was forced to honor a stupid promise that brought me the most extraordinary person I've ever known." Grace stood up and hugged her husband. "You know what I've learned all these years?" "What?" "That sometimes the worst situations lead us to the best destinies, but only if we have the courage to turn them into opportunities. And you had that courage." "We did, Richard. Together." That evening, during family dinner, Eleanor, now 15 years old, asked a question that took her parents by surprise. "Dad, Mom, can I tell your story in my school project about unconventional families?" Grace and Richard looked at each other and laughed. "Of course you can," Grace replied. "But tell the whole story. Tell about the mistakes, the lessons learned, about how two very different people can build something beautiful together. And tell about the importance of keeping your word," Richard added, "even when it's inconvenient." Richard Jr., now 11 years old, looked at his parents curiously. "Dad, did you really try to humiliate Mom in front of everyone?" "Yes, son, and it was one of the worst things I've ever done in my life." "But if you hadn't done it, you never would have gotten married?" "Probably not." "So sometimes bad things lead to good things?" "Sometimes," Grace replied. "But that doesn't justify doing bad things. It justifies turning bad consequences into something better." The family conversation perfectly illustrated how Grace and Richard had managed to create an environment where honesty, growth, and responsibility were core values. 20 years after their marriage, when Grace turned 52, she received an unexpected offer. A national chain of stores wanted to buy her brand and expand the concept of ateliers with social projects across the country. "What do you think?" she asked Richard after reading the proposal. "I think it depends on what you want for the future. This has always been your creation, your decision." "No, Richard, it's our creation. You've been with me from the start, offering support, resources, ideas. I won't make this decision alone." The discussion went on for several weeks. They consulted their children, who were now teenagers, with their own opinions. They talked with the atelier employees, whose lives would be affected by the decision. In the end, they decided to accept the offer, but with specific conditions that would ensure the social projects remained the main focus of the expansion. "Are you sure you want to do this?" Lindsay asked during one of the family meetings to discuss the decision. "We are," Grace replied. "The time has come to share what we've learned with more people." "And you? What are you going to do with all your free time?" Grace and Richard exchanged a knowing look. "We're going to travel," Richard said. "There are many places we want to see together. And we're going to write," Grace added. "The story of how two completely different people can build something beautiful when they stop fighting against each other and start fighting together for the same goals." The sale of the atelier was completed 1 year later, in an emotional ceremony where Grace officially passed the leadership to one of her former students, now a competent 35-year-old businesswoman. "All I ask," said Grace during her farewell speech, "is that you never forget that true success isn't measured only in financial numbers, but in transformed lives. Every young person who goes through our courses carries with them not just technical skills, but the certainty that it's possible to change their life through honest work and dedication." The first year of retirement was a difficult adjustment for both. After decades focused on work and family, having free time was almost embarrassing. But gradually they found a new rhythm. They traveled to Lebanon, where Richard showed Grace his family's origins. They visited small towns in the Brazilian countryside, learning about social projects similar to what they had created. And they began to write. Their book, When Destiny Wears Red, became an unexpected success, inspiring dozens of other people to transform negative situations into opportunities for growth. Did you ever imagine your story would inspire so many people? Asked a journalist during an interview about the book. We never imagined, replied Grace. We thought it was just our personal story, but we discovered that many people face situations where they need to choose between accepting humiliation or transforming it into strength. And what's the main lesson you want to convey? Insisted the journalist. That true relationships aren't built only on passion, answered Richard. They're built on mutual respect, shared goals, and the conscious decision to grow together. And that sometimes the greatest blessings come disguised as the greatest humiliations, added Grace. The secret is having the courage to see the opportunity where others see only problems. At Grace's 60 years and Richard's 55, they became grandparents. Eleanor, now graduated in business administration, had married and given birth to a girl they named Margaret, in honor of her great-grandmother. What do you want to be called by your grandchildren? Asked Eleanor. Grandpa and Grandma, they answered in unison, laughing at the simplicity of the answer. Watching their own children building their families brought deep satisfaction to Grace and Richard. Eleanor had inherited her mother's entrepreneurial spirit and was developing an app to connect local artisans with urban clients. Richard Jr. was studying medicine with the intention of working in underserved communities. They learned the lessons well, commented Richard one evening as they watched their children playing with their granddaughter. They learned that success without purpose is empty, agreed Grace. On their 30th wedding anniversary, the party was a celebration not just of marriage, but of 3 decades of social impact. The original atelier had transformed into a network of 50 units spread throughout the country. More than 10,000 young people had gone through the professional training courses. 30 years ago, said Grace during her speech, an arrogant man tried to humiliate me using a dress as an instrument of cruelty. Today, I can say that red dress became the most important symbol of my life, not because it brought me wealth or status, but because it taught me that true strength comes from within. She looked at Richard, who was sitting in the front row with their children and granddaughter, and it brought me a partner who learned from me as much as I learned from him. Richard stood up and joined his wife on the small stage set up in the mansion's garden. The dress I'm wearing today, he said, indicating an elegant yet simple suit, isn't made from expensive fabric or famous brands, but it was made by one of the students from our first workshop, because I learned that the value of things doesn't come from how much they cost, but from how much they mean. The party lasted until late hours, with different generations of people who had been touched by the story of Grace and Richard. Long-time employees, former course students, business partners, family members, and friends of decades. When everyone had left and the house finally fell silent, Grace and Richard walked to the garden where they had had so many important conversations over the years. Any regrets? Asked Richard, revisiting a question he had asked many times over the years. None, Grace answered without hesitation. And you? Just one. What? That it took me so long to realize that the most valuable person in my life was working in my house for 5 years. It didn't take that long. It took exactly the time it needed to take. They sat on the bench where they had their first serious conversation about marriage 3 decades earlier. Do you know what makes me proudest about our story? Asked Grace. What? That we managed to prove that it's possible for 2 completely different people to build something greater than themselves, without losing their identities, without one dominating the other, but growing together. And that we managed to teach that to our children, and to thousands of other people through our work. At 70 years old for Grace and 65 for Richard, they launched a foundation dedicated to promoting purpose marriages, relationships based on shared goals and mutual growth, as opposed to just physical attraction or financial convenience. The foundation offered courses for young couples, workshops on conflict resolution, and mentorship programs with more experienced couples. Do you really believe it's possible to teach people to have better relationships? Asked a journalist during the foundation's launch. We believe it's possible to teach principles that make relationships stronger, Grace answered. Communication, respect, shared goals, the ability to grow and change together. But what about love? Isn't the feeling fundamental? Of course it is, said Richard. But there are many kinds of love. Love based only on emotion is volatile. Love based on conscious choices and consistent actions is lasting. Our marriage proves that it's possible to build deep and lasting love even when it doesn't exist at the beginning, Grace added. But that requires work, patience, and commitment to mutual growth. End of story. What an incredible ending. This story shows us that sometimes the greatest challenges can turn into the greatest blessings. Grace and Richard proved that true love can grow through respect, partnership, and shared purpose. Now we want to know your opinion. Do you believe that relationships based on purpose can be more lasting than those based only on passion? Share your experience in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more exciting stories.